My big question to you, given that the BRICS summit is now over, and it seems like the Western media is coming to its senses and saying that Russia are not so isolated, I wanted you to go over, if you could, how this BRICS summit reflects a lot of what we've talked about here about this admission, where we now are seeing not just the failure of sanctions, but also Russia being an engine for economic development worldwide. So how did this happen, and how have sanctions played a role in this backfiring of NATO and U.S. policy toward Russia and the rest of the world?
Well, if ever you wanted an example of the notion of unintended consequences, here you have it. The last thing that the United States' neocon foreign policy establishment wanted was to strengthen Russia. They seem to have decided that Russia is the great problem in the world and that they would concentrate on damaging, weakening Russia. That's a major part, not only of the war in Ukraine, but particularly of the economic side of it, sanctions program of stopping purchases of oil and gas by Europe from Russia. Russia provided the cheapest oil and gas that Europe could have found anywhere. Because of the cheapness, European products were lower priced. They didn't have to raise the price as much because they got the cheap energy. And that made European economies successful, competitive, able to export, which the engine of European growth has been, Germany, above all, as an exporter. All of that was undercut when the sanctions went into effect in order to weaken Russia. But they didn't work. And they didn't work for two reasons that will help everyone understand why BRICS is so important. The first reason that those policies didn't work is that Russia was able to turn to its BRICS partners, its BRICS allies, with whom Russia had been developing relationships for many years. BRICS wasn't an organization formed last year or the year before. It's older. And Russia had cultivated, in lots of ways, relationships with India, China, South Africa, Brazil, the people who make up, the countries that make up BRICS. And so they bought Russian oil and gas, to make a complex story short and sweet. And Russia wasn't weakened. Russia turned out to be strengthened. The second unintended consequence was that Russia strengthened itself by turning to the BRICS, but it was a two-way arrangement. In order for India and China to buy the oil and gas from Russia, by the sanctions levied by the United States and its G7 Europe allies, plus Japan. And so the BRICS became better coordinated, more dependent one on the other, more having their economies intertwined. Bottom line, Russia and the BRICS became stronger, and the United States became less powerful because of it, more isolated because of their own decisions to have the war in Ukraine, which wasn't necessary. And that isolation of the United States is now deepening because of its decision to be as supportive unilaterally to Israel as they have decided to be. The unintended consequence of trying to isolate Russia has been to isolate the United States. And that leads me to perhaps the most important point. The world has changed, and the United States is denying that to its own detriment. The BRICS is now a larger economic powerhouse than is the United States or the G7. China is coming closer and closer to being an economic equivalent of the United States, as everyone knows. And its alliance, now accounting for nearly half of the population of this planet, is going to overtake and surpass the United States, which is 4.5% of the population of this planet. The unique position of the United States as dominant coming out of World War II couldn't possibly have lasted forever. It was a delusion to imagine it. And all that's happening now is the foreseeable reality that the rest of the world has caught up, has figured out how to grow fast, catch up to the United States, surpass it. That was in the cards from day one, should have been planned for, wasn't, should have been understood, wasn't, should have been discussed and debated in the United States, wasn't. And I leave it to you all to understand that in our presidential race coming to its culmination now, there is virtually no discussion of what is probably the most important issue facing this country, the United States, which is how do we cope with, how do we work with, how do we live with the decline of the American empire, the decline of American capitalism, the rise of other capitalist economic and other systems around the world. That's what we're going to have to figure out. That is the issue we face. And denial, dealing, for example, with this BRICS conference in Russia as if it were a Russian event, as if it were all about Mr. Putin. It wasn't. It isn't. That's the same denial. You can't see what's going on because you have to rewrite it as the old Cold War struggle of the United States versus Russia. It's not only tiresome, it leads you to make catastrophic mistakes, like the war in Iraq, like the policies in the Middle East, and indeed everything else coming down the pike, so long as one of the two superpowers pretends that it's not one of two superpowers. It's pathetic and dangerous to watch.
At the BRICS summit, there was actually very little talk about Ukraine, but in their declaration, they came out very strongly, unsurprisingly, given that Russia is the president. But as you said, sanctions have had a huge impact on the world economy as a whole and have backfired dramatically on the United States and especially its partners in the Western world. So given that we have a situation where the United States policy and therefore NATO policy is more sanctions, more tariffs now, talk of tariffs from Donald Trump should he become president on any country who tries to move away from the US dollar. Given that attempting to isolate the world economy from Russia in particular is going to be just policy, no matter who's president of the United States, what are the consequences of this for the US and NATO in particular economically moving forward? Because I think BRICS sent a pretty strong message that their trajectory is upward.
Yeah, I think that the prognosis for the United States, if it continues along the lines you've just summarized, and you summarized them right, is very grim. It is for more isolation of the United States. Let me give you a few statistics. I'm an economist. People expect it of me. Let me give them to you because they crystallize, I think, what is going on. I decided, because of the BRICS conference, to take a look at how the economies of the G7, the United States and its major allies, Canada, Japan, Britain, France, Germany, and Italy, how they're doing in terms of economic growth, and then compare it to the 5 major BRICS countries. And I do that because the financial press here in the United States, participating in the denial I've been telling you about, has recently been congratulating itself because the economic growth of the United States for this year, 2024, which we can now estimate because most of the year is behind us, is scheduled to be 2.8%. Let me ask everyone, keep that in your mind, 2.8% growth in the GDP, the gross domestic product. That's a rough measure of the total output of goods and services in 1 year. That's expected to grow 2.8%, and that's faster than any one of the other of the G7. That is, all of Europe, Japan, Canada, going to grow even less. Okay, now let me compare that first to Russia, the other side of the Ukraine war. Their economic growth rate, and by the way, all these numbers come from the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, a Western institution dominated by the G7. So that's where the numbers come from. 2.8%, rah-rah, United States. Russia's growth in 2024, ready? 3.9%. That's a lot more, an awful lot more than 2.8. America wishes it could grow 3.9. Can't get anywhere near it, but we haven't begun. Let's turn next to China, 4.8. That's almost double the economic growth rate of the United States this year. And then we come to India, which is 7%, almost triple the level of the United States. And I wouldn't bring you these numbers for 1 year if they weren't, in fact, the kinds of numbers we have seen for decades. That's why the Chinese are where they are. They caught up. They grew faster. They figured out how to raise the standard of living of their people much faster than anyone ever did before. This is not an endorsement of the Chinese economy or society or suggesting they don't have lots of problems. They do. All countries do. They do too. But when it comes to economic growth, that's their strong suit, folks. And that's what makes the difference in the world economy, doesn't it? To pretend that this isn't going on, that this isn't suggesting where the future lies, of course they have a good humor among themselves at their conference. They are the growing, dynamic core of the world economy now. The West isn't. And that's not about to change. That's why you have to come to terms with it, rather than pretending that such situations don't exist or that it's all about Mr. Putin. It isn't. Let me remind you of another statistic. This GDP, this gross domestic product, the total output of goods and services in a year, we economists use that as a rough measure of how big, how important an economy is. What is its footprint in the whole global planetary economic system that we're all a part of? Okay, the GDP of the United States remains number one in the world, somewhere between 25 and 30 trillion dollars a year. That's the legacy of being the dominant economy for the last century. What is the GDP of Russia, our so-called enemy? 2 trillion, maybe 3. People should understand Russia has never been an economic threat to the United States. It can't be. It's too small. It may have a powerful military, Lord knows, but economically, not at all. The United States could, if it worked out an arrangement, easily come to terms with an economy that's so much smaller. The Chinese economy, that's a completely different thing. Their GDP is around 17, 18 trillion dollars, catching up. Exactly. And Russia and China together, and India and Brazil added, yeah, that gives you the powerhouse that I've been describing and that BRICS represents. The road forward with continued denial is a road into making mistakes. The United States made a mistake in the war in Ukraine. It's crystal clear. Let me remind everyone, at the beginning of the war in 2022, there were predictions from the president on down. Russia would be destroyed. Russia would fall to its knees. The ruble would collapse. Russia would become dismembered. Putin would be ejected. None of that happened. Nothing remotely like it happened. Why? Because they didn't understand BRICS, what it meant, what it could do, how it could intervene with Russia to change the outcome. More such mistakes are coming if you continue to pretend that we're all in some old Cold War 2.0 rather than in a new economic situation. Look, I do understand. I'm an American citizen, born here, lived here, worked here all my life. It is very hard to be in the period of decline of an empire. I'm sure it was hard for the British who lost their empire a century ago, and it was hard for the Dutch and the Persians and the Greeks and the Romans. Every empire that goes down is kind of hard. But we do have the benefit of knowing that and making at least some choices to accept it, to understand it, and to work out a live and let live with the rest of the world. Otherwise, the doom and gloom predictions of World War III and all the forms that is taking will in the end overtake us. Not because they have to happen, not because they're built into the system, but rather because a population having to face the decline of its empire, the decline of its system, wants to deny it rather than treat it in the manner that adults kind of know they ought to do.
I know you were at graduate school around the same time of economics with Janet Yellen. She recently announced more sanctions on the way against Russia. And of course, there have been increased tariffs on China. So this is all happening as the Biden administration and people like Yellen are on their way out. I wanted to ask you, Professor Wolff, a lot of people in the United States may be especially around tariffs, maybe less so sanctions, convinced that isolationism and maybe even economic war or economic hostility could serve to contain competitors, that perhaps that will bring back U.S. manufacturing and give the U.S. a chance to once again, as you alluded to, boom again, and that will then lead to benefits for American workers or U.S.-based workers. Could you talk about the folly of this potential connection? Because the U.S. has been doing this for many decades, using economic trade as a way to boast about the possibilities of American workers living better, but we haven't necessarily seen that. So what are the real effects of these kinds of policies, tariffs, perhaps even sanctions on workers of the countries that are imposing them?
Yeah, I think here again, you're going to see, as I answer your question, this projecting forward of the unique position of the United States coming out of World War II. I guess I have to hammer at that for a moment. Please remember with me, at the end of the war, the United States had one experience with bombs falling on its territory. That was Pearl Harbor at the beginning. Never again. No damage was done here in the United States. No bombs fell, no explosions happened, no invasion occurred, none of it. We lost some troops, but relatively much less than other countries. Meanwhile, all the potential competitors of the United States, Germany and Japan, the losers of World War II, but even Britain, France, Italy, who are our part of allies, part of opponents, they were all defeated. They were all destroyed. Their factories were bombed, their railroads wrecked, all the rest of it. So we came out a unique position. We held that unique position for most of the rest of the 20th century, the second half of that century. when we could do pretty much what we wanted. It didn't matter. We were so dominant, the economic system here. We helped the others rebuild from the war in Japan, in Western Europe, and so on. And we could do what we wanted. They had this notion that you're kind of alone in the world, that everybody has to adjust to you. That's over. And now it won't work. I'm going to explain why these tariffs are a mistake, as if you were in the position you were before. So I will slap you with a tariff and I will not suffer consequence. This is completely wrong. I'm going to give you the example. The best example, the easiest one, electric vehicles. They are the vehicles of the future. Between the damage to our health and the damage to the resource base of this planet, burning fossil fuels to move our cars and trucks is on the way out. It's going to be replaced not by the rational decision, that would be mass transportation, but by the irrational but profitable decision to substitute electric vehicles for fossil fuel burning vehicles. Given that, here's the reality. The Chinese participated, along with the Europeans and the Americans, over the last 15 years to produce a profitable electric vehicle. That competition has been won by the Chinese, above all by a particular company, BYD. And if you don't know what that company is, that's a sign of denying what's going on in the world. In this case, by the mass media who haven't told you about it. BYD produces the highest quality, lowest price electric car and truck. Bingo, there it is. They're selling it all over the world, including Europe, by the way. But you won't find those vehicles on the roads in the United States today. Nowhere, not at all. Why? Because there's currently a 100% tariff. What that means is if the car costs $30,000 bringing it in from China, you and I would have to pay $60,000 to buy it. 30 to the Chinese manufacturer and 30 to Uncle Sam, because that's what the tariff is, a tax. Here's what that means, my fellow Americans. All over the world, every company that makes things that compete with American products, companies that make shirts, companies that make food, companies that make software programs, they make anything. They all have to buy cars and trucks. It's part of their business. They're going to get the best quality, cheapest electric truck, and that will be reflected in low prices for what they produce. In contrast, Americans who have to pay way more for those electric trucks with the big tariff will charge much more for their products than their foreign competitors, and they'll lose business. And you and I will lose our jobs. Why? Because of the tariff. So this may sound good. It may look like you're being a tough guy, Mr. Trump or Ms. Harris. But what you're doing is playing a silly political game that will come back and bite you and me where it hurts. It is a crazy misunderstanding of how the world now works. We are an integrated planet. The airways, the oceans are covered with boats and planes and trucks that are moving things from one corner of the world to the other. And the internet makes it possible to supervise and monitor production in the middle of Africa as easy as it is in the middle of New Jersey. But if you pretend that the world hasn't changed, that you still are in the world of the 1960s and 70s, well, then you act like the United States leadership is now acting. You're like a 2-year-old confronted by a dog whose barking frightens you, who puts his or her hands in front of his or their eyes and imagines that if I can't see it, well, it isn't there. You are assumed to be about to mature to a point where you understand that with or without your hands in front of your eyes, what's out there will be there and will affect you one way or another. And there might be better procedures for you than covering your eyes. In fact, almost anything would be better than covering your eyes, because that's not going to solve anything. This is not a complicated situation. The very fact that I have to say such obvious things in a program like this is a sign that there's something wrong in the general discussion. The whole world, let me drive it this way, the whole world is discussing desperate military action that the United States is taking in Ukraine and Israel, Gaza. The whole world is discussing this spectacular rise of the BRICS and corresponding relative decline of the U.S. and the G7. There's not a few people like me bringing it up. We only appear that way because we are awash in a program of denial that psychologists will be looking back on in the years ahead, wondering what in the world possessed that many people to participate in that amount of self-delusion when it was so dangerous and so costly.